the sort of kind of checks and balances and assurances that you'll want for deploying a chatbot in a retail context will be quite different to the sorts of assurances you would have if you were wanting to deploy it in a medical context. The first thing that we'll ask for if we ever come and knock on your door is we'll want to see the DPIA, and we'll want to see the DPIA that was in place exactly at the point of time at which you started the processing. Controllers need to think about the applications in their own context, and a processor can't do that for you because they won't necessarily know and understand exactly what data might be available.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control, which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Stephen Almond is Executive Director for Regulatory Risk at the UK's Supervisory Authority, the ICO, or Information Commissioner's Office, leading the teams in charge of engineering information rights into the fabric of new ideas, technologies and business models. Prior to joining the ICO, Stephen led a World Economic Forum initiative to promote the adoption of a more agile approach to regulation with governments and tech firms worldwide. He's also worked in leadership roles across the UK government, working on projects that have helped unlock technological innovation. In the past few months and years, the ICO has released guidance on AI and data protection, as well as on privacy-enhancing technologies, which we have discussed here at length. I will always applaud how practical and accessible the UK Data Protection Agency manages to keep everything they publish. I've been referencing their work in real-life scenarios, in courses I've been teaching, and even in a few tools we've been putting together. So I'm really honored to have Stephen Almond here today. Let's get on with it. Stephen, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
We wanted to talk about this overlap between AI or AI governance or responsible AI. And I know everything has a different meaning to different people, but that overlap with the GDPR and to see whether the UK could survive without doing anything similar to or embracing the EU AI Act. How would you approach that overlap?
You're, of course, absolutely right to say that data protection law is a really powerful tool in getting the governance of AI right. So much of AI is either trained on, developed using personal data, or personal data is used in its deployment. And so data protection law applies across the whole of that AI lifecycle. So it has a really crucial role to play. And what we're seeing very much is that the sorts of things that people are saying are really important in the governance of AI, whether that's fairness and tackling bias, whether that's safety and security, whether that's transparency and explainability, or questions of accountability or redress, are already very well covered in the space of data protection law. These are, in many cases, either foundational principles or rights that people have. So it's really interesting then to get into the debate around, well, what else is needed? Now, of course, data protection law, I'm not going to sit here and say that covers everything in relation to AI. AI is, by its very nature, a general purpose technology where the risks associated with it very much relate to the context in which it's deployed. And so it's really right, in my view, that we actually build up from what we have already, that we don't try and create completely new sets of rules for AI in terms of how it's going to be used in medical contexts or financial contexts, where it's actually needing to be aligned with and built on the same sorts of rules and norms and ethics that we have for financial decision making or medical decision making. We already have regimes around those sorts of issues, just as we have regimes covering the processing of personal data. So to me, it really does make sense to start from the strong framework of existing expert regulators that you have who are able to govern AI in their right contexts and domains, and then to kind of go, well, where's the gap? Where's what actually does need to be closed off, rather than trying to create a single regime to kind of cover it all. We don't have a single regime to cover all of computing or all of mathematics. I struggle a little bit with the idea that we should have a single regime for all of AI.
Is there something there in the unclear threshold between anonymous data and personal data that means that we would need to apply these principles, even though we do not yet know whether whatever we're using for training purposes is personal data, and therefore the GDPR applies beyond what we originally thought?
Wow, there's a lot in there. So let me start from the point that you've sort of based this on around the definition of personal data, and I suppose how far it goes in this context. As I think you know, in the UK, we apply what I consider to be a very pragmatic and proportionate approach to defining and interpreting what is personal data in this context, rather than the sorts of absolutist approaches that you might find elsewhere that mean that essentially it's anonymization is a goal that never can quite be reached. So look, it is certainly possible to achieve anonymization, but actually we do need, I think, to see the development of methods, of technical approaches to really help understand the difference here between models that contain personal data, that are vulnerable to model inferencing attacks, to other ways of kind of unlocking some of the personal data that might lie within, versus actually models where there is such sort of carefully inserted noise, shall we say, within them, that really we're not talking about personal data in terms of the end output. Of course, if you're training a model based on personal data, the very act of training of the model itself is, of course, processing of personal data itself.
Very good, thank you. So then, going a bit further down into the practicalities of it, right? You've got plenty. The one thing I see out there in the market is people embedding the models that others have developed or building on top of models. So you've got all of these suppliers, right? Normally they'd be processors, and they have been developing specific systems. I'm not using that terminology from the AI Act, where you've got the specific purpose system on top of a generic purpose model or a generic purpose system. But in the end, it means people that don't have the capability to train a model, don't have the means to come up with something new. They sit on top of an API or a system that someone else has developed, and they apply it to that specific use case. And for now, what we see is that they do try to do their homework, understanding what's inside. But these are all black boxes. Is there anything in terms of these principles, I guess, first, transparency, maybe that's probably the most important at the outset, that we could look at?
This is not something that's particularly specific to AI, where you as an organization are determining the purposes and the means of your processing, you have obligations in terms of how are you going to give people assurance that you are taking rights and the principles of data protection law very seriously. Where you are working with third parties, how do you get the assurance that actually enables you to fulfill your obligations as a data controller?
Yeah, because I was thinking from the point of view of a data controller, I know what I would be asking, right, from my processors. But when I am not yet sure that I'm processing personal data, you see, that's sort of the dilemma that I'm after, where we don't know. We want to use the principles, and we find common ground in the principles that apply to AI governance, to data governance as a whole, maybe, and then to data protection. But we're not yet sure that we're going to be processing any personal data. Eventually, there's always the risk, because there's going to be an interaction with people. There's going to be a user interface. There'll be prompts. Maybe that data will reinforce the learning. So at that point, something that I believe is missing is some sort of nutrition label or something where I can understand how every one of these systems is built, in the sense that they're all sitting on top of an OpenAI or an Anthropic or a Gemini, Google, whatever. And it's very hard to tell. So I hope we can find a way for these, what we call data processors in data protection, right? Or those that recycle or sit on top of the solutions that others develop, can find a method to audit them.
So, kind of a few angles on this. First is to say that, of course, when you are developing a model based on personal data that you've collected, even if you're then later providing that model to other third parties for them to apply in deployment, when you're undertaking that work at the development stage, you yourself, of course, have got obligations under data protection law for the processing of that personal data. So that in itself should act to provide parties with some degree of assurance here. But of course, when you are deploying models, you need to know what the model is you're deploying. And if you're going to be processing personal data by providing it as input data, when you're deploying a model, you need to know enough about how it works in order to be able to satisfy yourself that you're complying with data protection law. That'll be quite different context by context. So the sort of kind of checks and balances and assurances that you'll want for deploying a chatbot in a retail context will be quite different to the sorts of assurances you would have if you were wanting to deploy it in a medical context, for example. And it's going to be really important that organizations do take that responsibility and accountability for that processing, rather than just hoping that everything's going to be okay with the processor further upstream.
Yeah, thank you. You know, something that replicates itself that is very similar I'm thinking in AI, similar to what happens in data protection, is that you've got self-contained systems. And this is coming up really, this is sort of a proliferating. You've got all of these suppliers of self-contained hardware that embeds AI features. Our phones very soon will have more and more AI features. And in the data protection space, for example, you will have manufacturers of surveillance cameras. So the manufacturer will now be embedding more and more functionality and sell it as a closed device to a potential data controller. Since the controller is not asking and I'm being very specific, but maybe too specific, you'll tell me, if the controller is not really asking the manufacturer to do any processing on its behalf because it was sold without any ideas or any clues or any instructions as to the means or the purposes, so far we've understood that there's no obligation, in the sense that this company is not a data processor. It's selling something that someone will be using, just like a mobile phone could be used in a million ways. But this is getting more complicated because all of these devices are embedding these models. And so I sell my smart camera, for example, to a few people. It embeds some training. It may be carrying some biases. Should we look at that from the lens of product liability, or do you think there's an angle here to apply our basic principles, data protection principles, or maybe for these people to be subject to further scrutiny, unlike we've ever seen before?
Of course, you're going to get me to say that data protection law is going to be really important here, but let me give you an analogy, I suppose, to tease this example out further, because the scenario that you're describing is, in many respects, quite similar to some of the scenarios we see emerging with IoT devices, with a complex set of interactions between systems that weren't necessarily designed to work together, but that are being layered on together with a complex set of accountabilities between the people who have both done the development of the devices and who are deploying them in different contexts and in different combinations together. I'm not going to pretend that it's an easy set of issues to work through. This is definitely where data protection law starts to get it starts to require kind of more thought in terms of the respective balance of responsibilities. What I can say, though, is this is an area that we at the ICO have been studying and looking at for a little bit of time now. So actually, in respect of IoT devices, we will be issuing guidance in due course around consumer IoT devices and the sorts of data protection considerations that developers and users need to take into account. I think it's likely that actually we will start to draw conclusions from areas like that and start to see some parallels between those sorts of domains and the world of AI. But sticking with the world of AI for a moment, we've talked a little bit so far about responsibilities and who's responsible for what across the supply chain. And later this summer, we at the ICO will indeed actually be publishing a consultation on exactly that in the context of generative AI, looking at those roles of controller and processor and joint controller, and teasing out how we look at them in this context, and seeking people's views as to whether or not we're striking the right balance around this.
Yes, maybe this is the challenge that we needed to rethink this clear line between controller and processor, which is getting very blurred sometimes. Maybe that's what we need, a whole revamping of that concept. So, okay, so that makes a lot of sense. In IoT, there's a lot of people developing on top of all of these tools, and there's even programming languages to interconnect them, and there could be layers where the logic is separate from the devices, and then who's the controller, and then who is going to have a new separate purpose. Yeah. Okay. So the biggest challenge that you think you'll have today when it comes to all of these companies rolling out, I see all over the UK, all over the world, there's so many companies either embedding some sort of GenAI system or saying they're doing it. So which are the biggest challenges that you see coming, or where you think it would make sense to make a specific effort if you're a DPO, or I don't know, or do you want to make sure that you've got everything in order?
Look, my first piece of advice for anybody operating in this space is a really simple piece, and you'd be surprised how many organizations hope they don't have to think as hard about it as we might like, and that is to undertake their data protection impact assessment, and to do it with real thought and rigor before rolling out the processing. It might seem to some degree corny for the data protection regulator to say that, but it's such an important device in the context of rolling out AI, which is incredibly context dependent, where some of the risks will be only really identified and mitigated by doing that hard work and thought about what is this product and what are you going to do in your particular context. It's also the first thing that we'll ask for if we ever come and knock on your door is we'll want to see the DPIA, and we'll want to see the DPIA that was in place exactly at the point of time at which you started the processing. So anybody that is listening that thinks that they can get away with writing it a little bit later and maybe leaving some of that thought process to time in the future, I really don't recommend that.
Thank you. You're addressing a very present concern. That's I can totally feel that one. So speaking of DPIA, they're getting very technical, and that's a challenge for smaller companies. Controllers don't really understand what the mitigation measures could be, even the risks, because technologies are going deeper and deeper, being very specialized, especially if you start adding AI features. So something that I see is that now processors are expected to come with their own template or their own proposal for the risks that they carry and the measures they propose, meaning that there's a sort of a pre-cooked DPIA template that the processor is proposing to the controller, because the controllers are dealing with so much stuff and so many technologies, they cannot really cope with it. The problem with that I've seen is that then the controller needs to trust the processor's own estimate of its own risks. So, because nobody has so many, for example, privacy engineers on board to understand so much. And you've yourself signed that a very good paper, I think it was last year, or maybe time flies, maybe 2 years ago, on pets, right, on privacy enhancing technologies. And that's a very good example. Great measures, not so many people applying the most sophisticated ones. We've had a few interviews here on specific pets. But how do you see that gap? Do you think that it's acceptable that we're finding this gap and therefore controllers need to rely further on the processor's own assessment of the risks they carry?
So look, in many respects, it takes two to tango here, right? It is incumbent on controllers to be asking the right questions. And of course, they need to get candid, open answers from processors in this space. But controllers need to think about the applications in their own context. And a processor can't do that for you because they won't necessarily know and understand exactly what data might be available. One of the things that we started to see, for example, is the use of generative AI in enterprise contexts where organizations are deploying it, but actually they don't really know what data they hold internally. And it's starting to generate some surprising results for them, which are then actually forcing them to do some very rapid assessment of actually some of the underlying risks. Now, of course, what they should do in this scenario is they should have really actually done the hard thought up front about what data is available within the organization, made sure that it was well governed in the first place, and then being able to identify the risks that could have come from making so much enterprise data available in a Gen AI context within their organization.
That's very clear, very useful. Stephen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all for today. Please follow the Masters of Privacy channel on LinkedIn if you want to find some interview transcripts, cheat sheets, and other useful resources and surprises every now and then. On top of that, episode notes and other feeds are available on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.